All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And we're talking today on one of my special topics of interest, one of the things I really enjoyed talking about. So I love that so many people are here because it makes me feel, I definitely think this is really important, but I also find it really interesting. So hopefully you guys will find it interesting and exciting also. My name is Emily. I'm a postdoc here with Dr. Landa, and I'm really excited to be here. And I'm presenting some information that we got from research I did at Trinity College. So it'll be research from an Irish and UK sample, as well as kind of getting into research that we just presented last week, actually at a big conference. So some stuff coming right out of here, as well as other research presented at that conference. So it's hot off the press, new findings as of last week. And then you'll notice that as we cite, sometimes I'm citing the conference as well as publications. So you can make note of that as we go on. Should I speak? I walk around a lot, but I'll try to stay to the mic if that helps. Is that helpful? All right, I will plant myself as much as possible. My inner Italian will be coming out. So we're gonna go over the importance of gender differences. The fact that everybody's here probably means you don't need me to convince you of this, so that is awesome. And we're gonna link this back. We're going to do an overview of recent findings, especially focused on teens and children. So a slightly older population than sometimes gets profiled. If you want to ask about younger children, there's also research that's out, and we can talk about that, especially at the end. We can go into some of those findings also. We're going to go over some specific research and interpretations. We're going to look at a qualitative study and some of those findings. And depending on time, it's dependent on how much we go into that, but we will definitely overview. And the current research at CARDS that's coming out on gender differences, and then do a quick summary and questions. What we're hoping that you'll kind of take home is going over the current diagnostic criteria. We're going to look at ways in which girls and boys vary in their expression of autism symptoms. And this obviously, we're going to be talking about very general group differences. So I'd love to hear in terms of clinical practice, in terms of classroom experience, what you're observing also would be really great because we're just sort of piecing out. So the research might be behind in some ways what the clinical people are seeing, what people are seeing in the classroom, what parents have noticed. And that would be an amazing thing to talk about if you don't mind me asking you for my own talk. And then we're going to go into ways of this, the way that we diagnose autism might overlook some girls. It's an incredibly tangled web. And so we're not going to get too far into it, but if you have questions, I'd love to jump into it with you. And then the implications. And the implications really tie back to why this is important. These missed services, perhaps the neglect of people with autism, and some of the ways that we could be helping them better. All right. So just to make a quick general caveat, I'm talking about gender differences. There are so many other factors which impact on the expression of autism symptoms. Class, culture, age, and we talked about some of those briefly, but I'm not trying to diminish them when I don't get into them. And so we can talk about how they relate back to gender as well. And if you have questions after the talk, let me know. We can talk about some of these other categories that definitely play in. And I'm obviously talking about group differences. There's amazing variation in terms of people in general, in terms of people with autism. So I am categorizing, but I understand that not everybody, girls and boys, are going to fit into the category, so I'm presenting. And then also just wanted to note that I'm talking about kids without intellectual impairment right now. And that is a small subset, but it's also where we see the largest gender ratio in diagnosis, 11:1. And when we look at people who are more impaired or severely impaired cognitively, we're seeing a closer to 1:1 ratio. There is definitely something in terms of IQ playing into how we're expressing symptoms of autism. And there's definitely lots of research as well if you have questions. But I'm just making a quick note that I'm talking about people without that cognitive impairment. And that's important, especially because we're focusing on gender instead of sex differences. So the gender in terms of socialization, it's going to be more along the lines of typical development, perhaps. That's my argument. And if we're not seeing severe impairment, we're not seeing perhaps, we're seeing more typical gender norms. That might be different if you were excluded from in different classes or sort of on your own a little bit more. Okay. I know a lot of people here from the clinic and from research, so I'm just going to overview this pretty carefully. We have amazing abilities with our clinical judgment and our current gold standards on how we're diagnosing, and we're doing great. We're very reliable, but right, there is a chance that human error and measurement error is intrinsic in some of these measures. And they were developed on samples that were predominantly male, as you guys might know. And there is some suggestion coming up right now that we might be overlooking some girls if there is this difference of expression. So we're looking for a very defined definition of autism with how we're scoring and looking and diagnosing. But that might not always be what we're looking for. Maybe if we think it's a male disorder, we're looking at guys more for autism. The changes that we have in the DSM that came out in 2013 are actually going to be adopted by the World National Classification of Disorders coming out in June, which should mean that's awesome. We're all on the same page. Before they were a little bit lacking or relaxing behind us. However, there's already some suggestion that our current diagnostic criteria might need to be updated. So Dr. Mandy just released this yesterday. He also presented at the conference. He's out of a University College London. And he's just suggesting, and he has a meta-analysis from last year also to sort of support him in some of these assertions, that this ratio that we're seeing may reflect an underdiagnosis. And kind of outlines this is perhaps because of a subtler manifestation of social and communication difficulties in girls on the spectrum. And the emphasis is mine. And this came out in the Simon Simplex publication Spectrum just yesterday. It's free access. You guys should be able to find it if you'd like to see it more. He wrote a whole article going through this. And this idea that perhaps we're seeing girls that are having the same symptoms, but just a little bit different. So the impairment and things might be the same, but they're expressing them differently is the argument that I'm going to make here a little bit on how we're doing this. And one of the main ways that we think this might be doing this, especially girls that are high functioning or don't have this intellectual impairment, might be actively controlling their symptoms, especially in an assessment. So they sort of know that some of their behaviors of autism might be considered odd, and so they're going to control them as much as possible in that clinical setting, in their peer setting. And where it might start coming out more then is at the home. So parent report might be a good way to get around this, perhaps. But sometimes teachers could also have some insight. They're seeing them for long stretches, but clinicians and researchers are only seeing them for that 2-hour period, maybe a little bit longer, maybe a day. And there's a suggestion that girls and boys as well, that camouflaging can happen across genders. They can hold it together, if you will, for that period of time. And we're going to have difficulties picking up. It's going to take a little bit closer of an examination, a little bit more careful picking apart of symptoms in order to get that. I'm adapting these from a slide from Dr. Happe, who also presented. This is one of her INSAR discussion points. And she just went through just sort of a quick reminder almost on how we get a diagnosis. And she wanted to ask everyone to think about how gender assumptions and our idea of what autism is might play into each of these. The idea of the human error. So a person, perhaps an older person, might feel different if they have autism. They might not know what the difference is. Or an infant might have different sensory expressions, and a parent needs to make that judgment that something is off. And they have to think something is off enough to take it to the next level. Most of the time, kids with autism aren't looking that different unless you look in terms of behavior. So there's no dysmorphia, there's no physical characteristics that we're seeing. So we're going to have to get over the fact that people might look, quote, typical for large periods of time. After that, perhaps we need to, that kind of builds into a parent or teacher concern. They might notice a concern, but not think autism, especially if it's a girl. They might think shy. They might think boy obsessed for a special interest. They might think this is sort of an obsessive disorder or eating disorder might be coming out. Or we might have other symptoms like anxiety that's more prevalent. And so other attributes of autism might be put in that category instead. And that might not be wrong, and because obviously there's lots of overlap, but we might not be thinking autism. But if they do think autism, then they're going to go to a clinician, or maybe they're going to bring them to the clinician anyway. And the clinician has to be able to think autism also. And then at that level, they have to score on the test, which maybe it's not the most appropriate measure all the time to get there. And then finally, they get the diagnosis. So this process can get elongated for girls with autism. We see a delayed age of diagnosis, especially with girls with high functioning. Generally, kids with high functioning are closer to age 7, 6.5 in American and UK samples. So we're seeing a delay for kids who are able to manage their symptoms a little bit better anyway. But that doesn't mean that they're not showing signs, especially in peer relationships, anxiety, and depression, that's going to come up and magnify itself, especially as they get older. So this lack of supports and services is actually the biggest issue. So we wouldn't need a diagnosis if the kids didn't need supports, if we didn't need the insurance company to help us get those supports, if they didn't need people to understand. And especially when we start getting into the qualitative side of things, we're going to see that people appreciate the diagnosis, at least some people with autism, in order to help define themselves and how they're thinking about themselves and understanding their own behavior. So it becomes important sometimes for a self-identification as well, and understanding why you're feeling this way and why people are responding a certain way. And cool. So I wanted to just to show you a brief snippet of a video, 2 minutes, I promise. Oops. And this is a video, it's off of a documentary on girls with autism in the UK. And the girls who are here, and they're just going to show you, going to explain why the school thinks, and then we're going to just have a brief show some of the girls in their classroom to give you an idea of what girls with autism can look like. Let's see if they're matching. Thank you, Hannah. Is that right? Yeah, perfect. I'm going to end just for a brief second with Dr. Hapehu's slide, I just quoted there. Looking good, she's explaining a lot. Here we go.
Range knows autistic girls can be identified just as young as autistic boys. They're just missing the clues.
The boys get identified at the age of 2 or 3.
So why aren't girls?
I think because we're looking at the wrong things. Yeah. I think, even young girls bounce through things that they're interested in. They read quite fast, don't they? Whereas actually autistic girls will really love it for a really long time with an incredible intensity. That means it's the only thing that they can.
And when we do recognise the signs, autistic girls thrive.
I think so. I want to work the leather, and I want to be a leather designer.
My mum and dad with my computer school.
These are like some of the most amazing people I've ever
En route to the next lesson, just enough time for some fun. Teenage girls with autism, accepted and understood, are the only school in the country specifically for them, preparing for real life in the world outside.
So that full documentary is also available if you wanted to watch it. And all those girls do have a diagnosis. That's, I'm not disclosing for them because that's on the free. And they've also put out their own video explaining female autism, and we hopefully will be able to get to that also. And cool. And yeah, so you might have noticed that some of those girls don't look any different from other teenage girls. And you might have noticed a few subtle language things. You might have heard some formulation difficulties. Some of their voices were perhaps different, and the lovely English accents aside. Other things we saw that were a little bit interesting there is that sometimes they would adapt an American accent from television shows. So pretty subtle sides, symptoms that you might need a lot of time with the girls to sort of see. But people have started to look into differences, and this was presented at INSAR this last week. And so what they did is they had parental report, and this is one of the Simon Simplex collection sites. So they had a pretty large sample initially, but I'm only going into, it's the 208, but they only had 28 girls. It kind of underscores the fact that having a sample of girls to study in research is also quite difficult, which is why some clinical report would be amazing. And so what I did for this slide, they presented on all of the data, but I'm only looking at the matched sample. So 28 girls with 28 boys with matched age and IQ, and just to look at some differences in how, their special interests are panning out. And their overall findings that you can sort of see up here are that a lot of these are within the realm of typical gender differences, especially the girls. And we might, thought it was interesting, national disasters are on the girls' side, which could possibly be interpreted as empathy or being concerned for other people's well-being. And Japanese culture is an interesting one, whereas perhaps the boys might fixate on a video game or a specific facet. The girls have a more general interest, which might be harder to identify. And boys have a few things that would pretty much red flag most of us. The mechanical systems, signs, road signs in particular. So that's something that seems odd and we'd probably pick up, whereas an understanding and appreciation of a culture would be more difficult. And then there were some shared interests, and I would have liked them to kind of parse out these fictional characters. And we wonder if girls perhaps are along the lines of, you know, Disney princesses, which might seem more acceptable than an elongated interest in Thomas the Tank Engine into early teens, for example. And there's other things that weren't in this finding, but were sort of highlighted in other findings, such as an interest in boys and boy bands for girls. And so this idea of boy crazy teenage girls, but to a point of a perceptive interest, is something that they were seeing, especially in that school. And that is a little bit hard to piece out. So the idea of when it becomes an interest and when it's too much of an interest, a specialized circumstance interest, it's more difficult perhaps in girls. Another one of these ideas, these theories are gaining more footing, is this idea of camouflaging. And this has been forwarded by Dr. Hall. And this is the idea that consciously or unconsciously, people with autism can hide their symptoms. And we're seeing it in kind of two different ways. And one of the girls described it as putting on my best normal when she goes out, to kind of fly under the radar. And this can have a lot of social benefits. It's easier to make friends. You can have a better job interview. But it's very hard and taxing to maintain. So if you're constantly regulating yourself, you're not stimming, you're not going through what might be a typical control or like a release for you. If you're really stressed, you're not going through what typically releases or calms you down. And that's something that's kind of important. And we saw some interesting things in our own qualitative work where the girls would talk about going to the bathroom if they needed to sim or go through some compulsive behavior. So even though they were still engaging, it was done very well masked. So we're obviously not going to follow a kid that we're assessing into the bathroom and watch them. But if we had, we would see some of these behaviors that the boys are showing within the assessment. And their ability to kind of report on this was really interesting. So the girls were very aware of what they were doing and how they were doing it. And there are measures of some of these more subconscious masking of behaviors. They'd look at parent report or self-report versus actual behaviors, and that difference is how they judge it. But for Dr. Hall's work, she just used a qualitative interview. And she'd ask people, what are you doing? How are you self-managing? And what are you doing consciously to help this, and why? Like, what parts of your behavior are you targeting? And we're seeing some issues though. So girls aren't as able to keep jobs, even though they can get jobs very well. So there's some long-term quality of life implications. They can do the interview, but long-term employment is more difficult. And we're seeing stress, mental health, anxiety and depression symptoms are higher with people who camouflage. And so there are situations where it's probably very helpful. We probably all do some form of camouflaging, some social awkwardness or other things, but the extent to which the girls and boys with autism are doing it is putting a mental strain on their well-being. And we're also seeing that boys do it less. Also kind of an interesting finding is that with age, we also do it less. So once we're seeing people with autism into their 50s or 60s, some of that camouflaging drops a little bit. The idea is that perhaps we're interacting more with other people who also have autism, so the social circle is more accepting, or we've had friends for longer, so they're more accepting. The other idea is that with age, we just care less. So it might be a very typical response if we think of our certain grandparents that I might be related to. I feel like that is true. Oh, yeah, please. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could. That was used within some of the talks at the conference, but I haven't seen it in the article. I saw mental fatigue, which might be a similar idea. And I wouldn't be surprised though, because some of the authors on Dr. Mandy's would be self-advocates also who sort of play in. So I wouldn't be surprised if they were using the terms, because it makes perfect sense. And it's a problem that we're seeing. And yeah. There's some interesting studies here. I just want to highlight one more. Dean et al. Had a really interesting observational study of kids on the playground, and they noticed that girls with autism on the playground are playing close but not with their peers. So to a casual observer, it looks like all the girls are playing together, but once you get closer, you see that the girls are just mirroring or parallel playing with their peers, whereas the boys don't have this. So whether or not that's a conscious or unconscious action, that's as young as 9 years old they were observing. So it's happening quite early. And cool. And this is just one quick, I'm conscious of time, theory that we're talking a lot about at the conference. And this is the idea of social attention. Whereas girls with autism and girls without autism, girls in general, seem to have a little bit more of a natural social attention. Higher response to face processing in terms of brain response. Eye tracking studies are following this. There's some physiological responses to human natural motion, whereas boys don't have as strong a response. And the girls with autism also have this response, which is interesting. And this natural interest will just facilitate so much. So if you're interested in people naturally, you're going to be better able to camouflage. You're going to be better able to mimic. You're going to be better able to sort of fit in. And if you don't have that interest, you're not picking up language cues. You're not watching people as closely for their nonverbal skills. There's a lot of inherent learning that's going to be from this very, very early infant skill. And there's some really interesting work that's on there as well. There's some citations below. And we don't need to get into this too much but this is from just showing another way we can interpret these differences. And we have kids with typical development down here showing less errors on our social measure. And we have boys and girls with autism up here, so showing more errors. And what we're noticing is that this is with nonverbal IQ. And we're seeing that there is a relationship for the boys, which is the blue, following gender norms, I guess there, with this nonverbal IQ. Whereas with the girls, there's a lot less. It's actually not, there's no difference in terms of mathematical responses. That means that girls, it looks like there's a different process of learning these social techniques. The typically developing kids have a very similar mirrored response, but obviously much less severe in terms of those pragmatic errors, the social language errors. And we could see this as two different things, that the boys are utilizing nonverbal skills as well, more intentional learning perhaps of these social language, or perhaps the girls are getting it a different way, but it does suggest a different process underlying these abilities socially. Cool. And I only wanted to, this is a very wordy slide, just to highlight the fact that there are differences in our socialization and typical development. Kids tend to segregate naturally, teachers, clinicians, we all know this, and parents see this. And it seems often that it's girls pulling away. And I'm going to emphasize that only because I want to say that girls in a girl friend group tend to be a little bit more punishing, probably unintentionally, of otherness. So girls with autism, while they might have less severe social mistakes, like they might be fitting in, they might be scoring better on our social measures, there is a theory that it's still a higher cost because girls' society rejects you a lot sooner. So we see girls thinking about relationships more in their confrontation styles. They're going to avoid instead of confront. And that can obviously mean there's going to be isolation for girls who aren't fitting into the norm. And that's really the point that all those words are trying to say. And the other thing we're just giving is that in terms of language and emotional conversation, girls as a whole are getting more of it from their parents earlier. That could be that girls have some natural ability to elicit this language, or that parents were a little bit biased. We talk more to our girls and we talk more about emotions to our girls. So there's going to be some natural social learning that girls are going to get above boys. Usually in terms of typical development, this doesn't really have a big impact. We see differences in language, but it's not severe. The idea with autism is that intervention, that early on difference might be helpful, might be giving girls a leg up, might be enabling them to fit in better, talk more like a girl, and interact better, especially on our measures. So, okay, we can get back to this. I know I'm kind of pushing a little bit along. Just as a quick oversimplistic slide, there's a lot more going on under the surface with some of our girl communication. Again, I know this is oversimplistic, no offense to our guys, but I think we've all seen this interaction also. And that would be much easier to learn, to teach, or to do some supports to get a guy with autism to handle out some of that male communication. There's a lot less that's going into it. Cool. So I'm going to take a very quick look at some of the qualitative from the interviews that we did. And I was looking at Ireland and the UK. That's where I was stationed. So our sample does come from English speakers, but there are slightly different cultural differences. And I don't think we can talk about this. I'd love to hear what you think, that what we found would be specific to Ireland and the UK, but please tell me if you feel like I got that wrong. So I looked at girls, 53 students, 30 girls, from 9 to 17. A lot of these kids that were in England were in a school that was specific to kids with social difficulties. They weren't always kids with autism, or it wasn't a school for kids with autism per se, but social difficulties did mean that about 97% of the people in those schools did have autism. And so everybody in the sample did have a diagnosis. And again, they were diagnosed on the UK system that was still using Asperger's. They're Asperger's and high functioning autism, to use some of the old terms. And we used the thematic analysis, going through the interviews, looking for patterns that came up. Any of these things that you'd like to talk more about, do let me know. And we use the ADOS interviews as a language sample. So a subset of the part that was conversational of the ADOS we were using as a language sample for the majority of this. When we looked at all these interviews, and I did all the interviews, and then I coded them for the ADOS, and then I watched them and coded them again on other social measures, and then I watched them again for this analysis. So I'm pretty well versed in these. If you have any questions or you want more context for the quotes that are pulling, let me know. Because I feel like I got these kids in my head, and they're amazing. So the themes that we identified that came up across the board are autism as otherness, and that's a positive and negative feeling. Sometimes that was a helpful thing to know, and sometimes it led to conflict. Experiences of anxiety and compulsive behaviors. I initially had them as separate, but when you listen to some of the quotes, you'll see that they are really linked, especially with the girls. So some of their anxieties would lead to compulsive behaviors. They were doing the compulsive behaviors to relieve, to sort of give release, but also because they wanted to do these compulsive behaviors, it made them more anxious. They knew they might want to do something they didn't want to do, often kind of a violent, what they were talking about. And so to prevent them from doing that would give them unease, their worries. And then finally, we have coping with depressive emotions. And then they have different methods of coping. And if we're running out of time, I'm probably going to skip to this because this has the most implications for where we might be able to help and kind of address. Cool. So looking at the first, autism as otherness, we saw it as both a source of resolution, where these girls had been labeled a million different things, didn't know what was upset, like what was wrong with them, and then finally got their diagnosis. It was almost always a release for their parents, and I talked to a lot of parents as well. It's not included in this, and I feel like sometimes the kids were feeling their parents' relief and getting a diagnosis. It also, for a large number of them, got them into the schools where they were currently, and the school change also led to relief of bullying and some pretty stark peer exclusion. So it led to some really positive things for some of these kids, but it also had some conflict. And they would talk about autism as something that needed to be controlled. They had this, and they had to sort of manage it constantly. And that obviously plays again into that anxiety and compulsion that we talked about. We had 21 participants talk about this, and it is mainly discussed by the girls. And you can see in the quotes, we'd be doing a lot more implication with the guys. Like I'd be kind of pulling them, just interpreting what they were saying. And the girls would almost hand it to you. And that could be just a very general gender difference, that the girls are more talkative about this. But this knowledge, awareness of their autism diagnosis could avoid conflict. So understanding of themselves. So sometimes other people annoy me since they keep on cuddling me since I'm the youngest in the age group. She was 15 actually. But I just tell them I need a break, and that seems to work. And then also that they can comfort each other when they're upset. But when her friend is upset, you leave her alone, and when she feels better, you can speak to her again. And then they learn these things from their friendships, and the friends are going to come up a lot. It's where I think we should probably, that's going to be our lift me up at the end after we get through some of those negative feelings. So also as a resolution, the friends in context, their support. So I feel happy to have a friend. A lot of times the friends in the school were almost a novel occurrence to some of these kids. I'm glad to have one. They like understand what special needs I've got. They understand what I'm saying. And my best friend is always there for me when I need it. He doesn't get angry when I do stuff. He doesn't pick on me because I'm different. And some of these friends were outside the special school as well. So they didn't always talk about if their friend knew if they had autism, but they seemed to understand the behaviors almost always. But there are also conflicts. And what was interesting is that their diagnosis could be a conflict even with those people who were closest to them. There were conflicts with parents, understanding symptoms, with grandparents, with teachers. And these are all people who are very well informed about the diagnosis and about parts of the behavior that are being caused perhaps by it. And the boys didn't really make a connection. I'm going to show you two examples or two exceptions to that, but we can see some of the conflict in the girls speak very readily. And so the difference between her and me, I think they treated me differently because I was different from other people. And I didn't realize that until I got older. So I used to think it was me. And this is a dance recital where she was forced to dance with the younger girls. So she was 15 and they told her to dance with the 8 or 9-year-olds. And she's also quite tall. So it was not like it would even a little bit fly. And it was horribly mortifying for her to have to do that. So she ended up quitting. And then this school makes me angry and sad. I just don't think I should be here. I mean, I know I have autism and I would find it hard in a mainstream school, but I would prefer it. The people and how the teachers treat you here, childish. They talk to you like you're a child. And this girl in particular had definitely had some other things going on. She would not present as anybody who would, I think it'd take a lot of insight to know she had autism or a self-disclosure. And what she's referring to is they took her cell phone because she was talking to older men on her phone. And so there's a bit of an issue here with how much protection you do. And she was essentially in lockdown. So she was experiencing a very negative side of the school when we were talking. And this conflict between dating or coming into dating at an age and how much protection is something that happens a lot with the girls and boys. And there's some amazing stories where they're dating each other and you get to hear about their amazing breakups and highs and lows and who said what, and that is awesome. We can talk about those as well. But there are some conflicts coming in on where you're not sure if other people are aware of the diagnosis and the misinterpretation and how to read signs and sexuality references. And it's hard enough probably for a lot of 14-year-olds to know what you're agreeing to if lots of things are wink, wink, nudge, nudge, but it's especially hard for these girls. So there were several talks at the school covering what a guy means when he says you're hot. What does he mean when he wants you to come over to his place to watch a movie? Right? So, and at what age he means that. And so there's lots of things that they did there. You could see this talking down to, but also why they thought it was necessary. And some parents expressed that as well. Kind of interestingly, sometimes this conflict was seen as a positive. One girl thought it was kind of a great thing that because she and her sister got to fight, they got separate special things they could do, which is great. And her sister seemed to feel the same. They got on what I saw perfectly fine, but apparently some breaks were helpful. But more commonly, there's this negative feeling. And this is sort of a tough situation where her grandmother was informing her that she had to date somebody normal or she shouldn't date. And then she tried to follow her grandma's advice and ended up spending some time with a guy who wasn't very nice to her on vacation. And that was hard to avoid. She thought she was doing what she'd been told and thought she was following directions, perhaps a little rigidly or to the very concretely rather. But I'm sure that's not what her grandmother intended exactly. Our two guys who sort of talked about this, about conflict in marriage. You can tell they don't mention their diagnosis, but I'm inferring it a little bit by their personal attributes. And this was a little sad. He didn't want to disappoint anyone and didn't feel like he was really marriage material. And so they had, interestingly, a lot of these kids from even 10 years old or younger for the girls, they had thought about this. They had observed their parents. They had thought about what would be difficult about having kids. You ask them what would be hard about it, and they'd be like, oh, well, I'm pretty hard sometimes. And you're like, awesome. So insight wasn't lacking too often. And this little 10-year-old boy was amazing. He talked a mile a minute. But yeah, he would talk about how he doesn't think he'd be able to have kids, but he didn't want to be totally alone. So he'd have a pet instead. And he promised to visit his sister and his mom. And these are the two boys that actually did mention autism specifically. So I don't think my autism should prevent me from doing things I want to do. And he had two siblings that did not have a diagnosis, and he felt that they had all these opportunities, and he wanted the same. And I just want to be alone, to be honest, like many other autistic people. And this is a 15-year-old. So he seemed to understand himself in terms of having autism in this one statement, but it was the only time they had mentioned it in their interviews. So I'm not sure if that means it's not as salient or it's an integrated part of themselves. You can look at it either way, perhaps. So we are seeing self-reflection on both. We're seeing a little bit more, like the older guys are having more insight. And what I'm not sure on, and if this is something that happens later in the guys with autism, or if it's just not as present. So we look at this just one time, one age range. So I don't know if kids who had it at 10 or didn't have it at 10 are going to get it at 15. I'm not sure if it comes out later. But we were seeing a difference there where girls could have it at almost any age in the sample that we saw. Cool. So anxiety and compulsions, like I said, were really intermixed. And this is not anything that's outside other literature or self-report or parental report. We're seeing increased mental health concerns with kids with autism. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the girls talked about these things but wouldn't show them. So they would talk about having these compulsive behaviors, they'd talk about their worries and their anxieties, but they wouldn't necessarily be doing any behaviors within the ADOS session or even within the school setting that I saw. And I was actually living at the school for a couple weeks. And so I was there a lot, and I didn't actually see too many of these actual behaviors. So nothing that would, example, code on the ADOS, if I was looking to code them on some of these things, but a lot of evidence that they exist. And that's one way, and perhaps this measure might be to be a little bit more flexible to capture some altered expressions of autism. So we're going to talk about some of the triggers that the girls and boys talked about, and talk about the management of how they do their behaviors and some self-regulation. Cool. So some of these are what you'd expect. So one of the girls talked about it in terms of this anxiety and compulsion behavior, in terms of her verbal obsession with asking questions. And she knows it upsets people and she'd love to stop it, but she wasn't always able to. Interestingly, a lot of girls talked about these things they had to do, and then somebody would ask them to stop and they would. So even though they were describing things that might be considered compulsive, they also had an ability to check that more so than perhaps some of the guys. And again, nothing that was actually seen too often within the interviews themselves. And a lot of the girls report some of these, a lot of trust issues with previous friendships, a lot of learning from difficulties, bullying behaviors, and exclusion. And nobody gave me any particular examples, but I would assume there was a lot of rumors and gossiping going on in previous schools from the number of times people talk about talking to their cats, talking to people, and why their friends are great to kind of hold down secrets and keep secrets and not talk about you. It's a little bit of things the girls were very, very aware of, and the boys didn't really seem to worry about. When we asked them about anxiety, the boys would talk about sort of physical feelings of anxiety if they had an answer for it, as well as when we talked about what might be triggers of anxiety. They talk more about spiders or drowning or very physical object things. And some of the girls would do that also. They'd be scared of something or have anxiety towards one object, but it would also be with any follow-up or in the larger context of the interview, there'd be all sorts of talk about anxiety in terms of friends and worries and behaviors. So even if it wasn't initially pressed by that one question, it usually came out in the interviews with the girls. And they said, yeah, like I mentioned, some of these things, and we also did a quantitative section. We looked to see if anxiety or compulsive behaviors were linked in any of the coding, and they're not on the ADOS. So however they're being defined on some of our more clinical measures, we're not seeing that relationship that seemed inherent in the spoken part of the interview. Something just to kind of keep in mind. When we're looking at management of these anxieties, so we're talking a little bit there about some of these behaviors that we're seeing. And they all had these little bit of coping techniques. And I'm not sure how effective they always were. They couldn't usually follow up too much. And this is where perhaps that camouflaging comes in a little bit, these costs of the social anxiety, avoiding situations where we think there might be an issue. Some of them stopped boarding it if they thought it was going to be a problem. It's possible that the boys had this more of an extreme fight or flight response. We saw a lot more violent behaviors reported in the boys by parents and schools, as well as self-reported. They would disclose pretty willingly why they got kicked out of their last school when you asked. And then some of the girls would have these behaviors also, but we saw them more so actually saw them in the boys. And this gets a little bit at camouflaging as well. One of our little girls talked about headbanging, but in order to get to sleep at night, to calm herself down. And so that would be done at night, at home, before she went to bed, which is some place that we probably would never see. And she mentioned that her dad doesn't like it, and he tries to prevent her from doing it. And this upsets her routine and prevents her then from getting to sleep at night. And that's one reason why she liked boarding, was because she was able to go through her routine. We had a couple of boys that mentioned sort of an odd feeling of enjoying this darker side. And maybe it was for a response, a reaction to the interviewer, but we sort of talked about this dark side super form, with his words, and when he gets really, really upset when something happens. And again, nothing that I saw in the school, which is great. I guess I didn't upset anybody that much, but we are seeing that they're aware of it. They know this is happening. And so when he said, I took it too far, it's also sort of interesting, and because that was the sort of talking about self, or understanding that he did something that caused it. And that was not always obvious when people were talking about it. Cool. This is the little girl I referenced before who was talking about how she avoided situations. And it's a reference when the girls talked about possible violent behaviors. We just got little references like this. It makes my hand tense up. I'm not in the mood. And she kind of showed you that she was making a fist. But she's not talking about the violence in the same way that the boys might talk about, which is a possible gender difference also just along and typical, but also this idea of social responsibility. I wouldn't be fair to them to have this response. Cool. So we know that internalizing disorders are higher in girls, and we're seeing that in terms of their expression of anxiety and depression also. And we're seeing this experience being very conscious, and they're very aware. I'm going to push on just to make sure we finish up at some time. And we're going to have some unsurprising increases of depression in this group, and their experiences of being sad, but they did talk about it very differently. And not surprisingly, if you feel separate from other people, if you have this isolation from other people, that it's going to be led to depression, and a little bit sad. And this idea of being excluded from the group comes up a lot. And there were a couple of situations where boys made a reference I would not have known was referring to huge bullying and isolation, except that a teacher or parent had referenced it. So it's possible I would assume, or I would suggest, that these differences that boys are feeling the same, maybe not discussing it. And they had a lot of kids to get to the schools where they were placed with had to go through sort of issues with their other placements at the other schools. But happily, sometimes this new school, a placement where people a little bit more supportive of other kids with autism, seems to be a decent caveat that gives a little bit of a relief to those feelings of exclusion. And a girl and a guy both actually talked about this difference of not doing enough to make friends and not knowing what else to do, but not being able to, kind of taking responsibility for not having friends, which made me feel a little sad also. And we had a few of those. Often the boys would talk about these feelings. It was in the past. I used to have these issues, but I don't now, or it's transient. It's happened, but it's fine. So I do get lonely all the time, but I don't take it as the worst year of my life. And feeling sad is a normal thing. So even though he's lonely all the time, he thinks it's just normal. He's actually saying this with a bit of a smile at the end. And so it doesn't seem, and he seemed to have a lot of friends being very well integrated, but it was an interesting thing that he's admitting to feeling lonely, but without having, and without seeing it as a negative thing per se, or an unusual thing at least. And one thing that was hard, and this is where I feel like we could possibly make some improvements, is this limited coping that we were seeing. And so sometimes if people are sad, it is our kids with autism seem to have this downward feeling. They didn't know how to pick themselves back up. So they just be sad. usually this was okay, these kids are kind of young, but we did see some instances of self-harm in the girls that sort of came from these feelings, and a lot of teacher intervention, a lot of peer support, trying to get kids out of that habit. But one thing that was positive to kind of end is this importance of friends and friendship in terms of alleviating these symptoms. So even when the girls and guys weren't necessarily able to regulate their own feelings, having friends and having their friends come in and know how to talk to them, how to get them out of that dark place, seems to be the best way, more so. And a friend could be a teacher also, but in the context of these interviews, they were only other peers. And they seem to be able to help, especially away from home, where they had the typical comforting objects they could go through, their routines and everything else. So at a school setting in particular, having this peer support was one of the most important things. So I like the picture too. So this girl says she just has to ask, she's generally asked the classroom when she's upset, can someone just make me laugh? Because I'm sad and I want to laugh now and I don't know how. And then her friends make her laugh and she feels better. So even though maybe perhaps we're not seeing an ability to always self-regulate or pull ourselves up, the friends do seem to offer this amazing support. One thing that's interesting is that I tried to prompt, this is a girl, the kids who would say this, they do know what makes them happy. If we ask that question in the ADOS, what makes you happy? And so you can sort of see there could be, you'd hope that you could bridge that, what makes you happy, to when you're sad, can you make yourself happy? But that might be something that needs to be a little bit more taught. It didn't seem to be intuitive, and that might be one direction that we take this. And I hope that would be helpful. One of my favorite quotes from the whole, like all of the girls, was a girl who had a lot of difficulties coming in. I changed the name, that's not obvious. So I asked them a lot why they like me, her friends, and they said, because you're awesome. That's how I know they're my friends, because a lot of the time I think, why should this person like me? I'm kind of a bit weird. And they just say, because you're awesome, which is amazing. And that's what all of our friends should be saying to us all the time, just because that we're pretty awesome. Cool. So we're almost out of time, so I'm just going to run through that quality study. You can watch the school interviews, or not my interviews, but you can watch these girls on their YouTube videos they made explaining autism. I have a link in the slides. They're amazing. It's put up on YouTube. It's free. It's great. There's also, that's where the documentary is also. And that's kind of a really nice way to sort of put some faces to the voices and a little bit more personable. So just what we just recently presented at INSAR last week was looking at some of these differences cross-culturally. So we had the UK sample that we just saw the qualitative interviews from, and we looked at the US sample that was right here from CARD, which is awesome. And what we're seeing overall is that we are both kids with autism. We're seeing that the EU kids seem to be making less of these social errors. We're not 100% certain how to interpret that. The measure itself is American, so we might be just sort of tapping into more nuances in the American sample, which is all right. The US sample also had slightly more boys, so that could also be, since boys are showing more errors overall in their social language, we might just be seeing an influence there. But we are seeing a significant difference between girls and guys with autism in terms of these social differences, which is great. Well, not great, perhaps, but it's interesting that this is across cultures, and that makes us feel like we're looking at something that's more universal. And one quick thing I do want to add, though, is even though these boys, again, are scoring higher, the implications for their scores might be more severe for the girls. They might be excluded more. They might be suffering a little bit more from the social outcast with the errors that they are making. It's also possible that girls are just camouflaging more. So we give them our interview, and they know exactly how to act for that period of time, and then they need to go out and they can be more themselves outside of that clinical setting. That's something. Cool. These are the two things in your slides also. This is the full documentary, free access. This is a little YouTube video made by the girls themselves explaining female autism. I love it. If we had more time, I'd make you watch it right now. But I wanted to make sure I could have time to, you guys can ask any questions. And my email is here again. If you want to contact me, if you want any other information, if you want full, like all of those references in full, they're on the slides, but you might not be able to read them. Yeah, me and Tom Hanks would be happy to help you.